Live from the Washington, D.C. area, all empowered citizens need to know about intelligent use of resources, smart governance, inclusive communities, smart industry, and healthy, thriving urbanization. This is Smart Sustainability, the TV talk about shaping a sustainable future in the digital age with Nicolette DeVidar. Good evening. Thanks for being with us tonight. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. Online learning is challenging. I probably don't have to tell you that because you may be among those who are affected. Students, parents, and teachers alike are struggling big time. Some love online learning, others hate it. For some it works, for others it works even better, and yet for others, not so much. There is frustration building up for everyone. And it gets yet another dimension when we add the concept of inclusion. Now, inclusive education has been controversial even before COVID. It took us a long time to start thinking that people can't be thrown in just two categories, one that's considered normal and another that's considered different. In fact, the 21st century makes us more and more see that everyone is unique. Of course, if you can't put people in preconceived categories and drawers, it makes things a heck of a lot more complex. But the major characteristic of complexity is that it can't be handled by simplifying things. In fact, simplifying complexity is a bit counterproductive, and the COVID challenges shows us that. So, with learning shifting almost completely online, are our inclusive classroom efforts out the window? How can we expose our kids to inclusive experiences from all sorts of manifestations in life at a time of seclusion and isolation when everything is virtual? Online learning is hard enough for students with no special needs, let alone for kids that learn differently. How do we ensure we don't fall into the trap of dividing kids into normal and different, which is an outdated concept anyway in the 21st century? Perhaps it's time to rethink our approach to education in general, because if there ever was a time for an education rewrite, it's now. That's what we talk about tonight. Plenty of data suggests that inclusion is a cornerstone of healthy societies. It boosts creativity and innovation, it boosts empathy and the human spirit, it broadens perspectives, and it's absolutely necessary to understand the world and ecosystems holistically. In brief, it's a key to mastering the 21st century. So where are we now with inclusive education, and how do we move forward? My first guest tonight is the Director of Advocacy of the ARC of Northern Virginia. Welcome, Lucy Beadnell. And I should see Lucy on the screen. There we go. Lucy, can you hear me?
I sure can. Thanks for having me, Nicolette.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on to Smart Sustainability. Lucy was actually on the show before, and we had a very lively discussion last time. So, you hear a lot from parents, Lucy. What's going on? What is the general status right now with inclusive education, given we live in an online environment?
You said so much that I feel like I hear every day in your opening, right? That for every single person I speak to, there's a different story behind what's working and what's not. For parents having the best to say about virtual education, they're able to say, oh, things are working academically because I have an upper level degree and I'm at home being a one-to-one aide to my child, but that leaves out inclusion. Like you said, even if those students are able to thrive on the academic side, are they making friends? Are they learning social skills from peers? Are they doing all those really critical things that I would argue is maybe what school is more about than just the subjects you learn and that are scored on a report card? And we've really seen families struggle with how to best put some inclusion ideas in place for everyone, even those for whom they're really struggling with virtual education or trying to get away from the computer and do things in other ways. And one of the big factors there is that folks with developmental disabilities are about 3 times more likely to die away from COVID. So even families who feel desperate for that peer interaction and know how valuable it was to their child just feel like it's a risk that they cannot take. And it breaks my heart. And I'm very worried that the further we get away from inclusion, really successful inclusion, the harder it's going to be to get back to it. But I do think COVID is a time where we have been challenged, and we're going to have to rise to a lot of those challenges. We're going to have to put on our creative hats. We're going to have to find new ways to do things as best we can now, and then go back into life when, once again, we're allowed to be in the same room with others, learning, hey, we thought some things are way better for me or for us virtually. Let's keep those parts and build the inclusion in around it. And I think that now that we've had educators have a little bit of a chance to get their feet wet in virtual classrooms, there are such cool ways to start thinking about including kids, right? I have a second grader at home who loves reading, and she would love nothing more than having a virtual book buddy. And so in her reading workshop, instead of just reading to her classmates, bumping out to a class with one or two other kids, maybe some of whom have disabilities, and as a group, they can learn through reading with each other, right? When she was in kinder, she had an upper level book buddy. These are great ways to partner students that already fit well into the academic schedule and can even start building some real friendships online. My kids, at least, are desperate for interaction with others and would be very happy to make more virtual friends.
That's good. So, apart from the actual online component, I know there has been it has been inclusive education has been controversial to begin with. There are some different viewpoints and opinions about this, but are there some specific frustration points that parents have voiced to you that were added on with online learning, in addition to not having the exposure and the experience and the physical contact? But what's with the actual learning? Is that affected too?
In a big way. And there's been some interesting divides. Like I alluded to, some parents have said their child is doing better than ever.
Academically.
Academically. Yeah. But more often than not, I get calls from parents who say, this way of learning and interacting, even with teachers, even with the students, and maybe even a segregated classroom setting, is so hard and unnatural for little kids that they just say, I don't want to do it. And it's such a different situation for a child to be in their living room with a parent and to throw an iPad and walk away than it is for a child to be in school with a trained educator and no parent there, right? Every child behaves differently around their parents, for better or for worse. And it has been a real challenge. And for kids who aren't getting the push and pull and the enjoyment back out of this process, they're just simply shutting down, and in some cases, literally shutting down their device and not engaging at all.
Oh, wow. Right. My second guest tonight is Diane Cooper Gould, and she is the chair from Fairfax County SEPTA, Special Needs Student Parent Teacher Association. Thank you so much, Diane, for coming on. And I really like to hear your viewpoint as well, because you're literally like right in the middle of it. What are some of the main frustration points and challenges that you hear from parents? Are there additional ones that Lucy hasn't mentioned yet? Something we're not aware of?
I think, we hear a lot of the same things Lucy was saying. I think you see a real divide between the younger students and the older students. It is definitely much harder for the younger students to engage for extended periods of time online. And I think with kids, one thing to think about is there's a lot of students with the movement towards inclusion who might spend some of their day in a self-contained or special education only setting, but then they spend another part of their day with general education setting. So what is becoming extremely difficult for these families is that the general education curriculum setting and the special education curriculum setting aren't necessarily matching up. And so they're missing out on one or the other. And often it's their inclusion time in the general education setting. So the complexity of scheduling online learning, and then when we start, I'm in Fairfax, so when we start bringing students back in, they're focusing on certain special education populations first. So what does a child do who spends half of the day, 50% in special ed and 50% in general ed? Do they go in or do they stay home? And it sounds like right now, no one's really figured out what's going to happen. It's kind of a wait and see, but it sounds like maybe those kids will come in and then spend part of their day online at school. So it's just really interesting. I would say that for families that need, the students need related services. So that's like speech therapy, OT, all different kinds of adaptive PE, things like that, physical therapy. It's been pretty hard on the families because those are specialty degrees of specialty jobs, and they require a lot of training, and the parents don't have that. So they're trying to give their kids these services based on a teacher telling them what to do, and it's can be really difficult. It puts a lot of pressure on the parents, puts a lot of pressure on the kids, because as Lucy said, the dynamic with a student and a parent is different than a student and a teacher. So there's a lot of complication there. I can say I have older kids. So I have a 15-year-old and I have a 13-year-old. And I will say that I definitely think in general, distance learning is going better for some of the older kids. However, I have both of my kids have IEPs. My son is autistic. My daughter is dyslexic and has ADHD, and they've had a very different experience. So my son is doing great on distance learning. Fantastic. And in fact, he's more included via distance learning than he was at school due to his specific needs. My daughter, on the other hand, loves school in person and is miserable on distance learning. She's a very socially motivated kid. She's very, loves the activity and the hubbub and her friends, and doing 6 hours to 8 hours online every day is miserable for her. And I'm noticing a lot of kids, and the older kids especially, there's depression starts setting in. You know, they're missing their friends. They're missing, I think Lucy sort of alluded to it, like the reward of school, the fun part of school. To us as adults, kind of like a long time, but you know, we see the end of the tunnel. For a kid at no matter what age, a set amount of time feels much longer. So they're missing out on huge developmental periods while they're home. And I think that's another piece of the puzzle.
So actually, when I listen to all of the pieces of the puzzle, it sounds pretty chaotic to me, quite frankly. So you have the uncertainty, you have a new dimension by the kids being suddenly with the parent who's becoming sort of the teacher aide. You have a lot of the courses now. Let me ask you, are the courses, the curriculum though online, they also are different from school to school, right? Because teachers are given, are they not given a certain leeway to construct their own online experiences the way they want to, they think it's best?
Well, I think always in Fairfax County, at least, you know, they always have to operate within a guideline, right? They have to operate according to the curriculum, but it's always been up to the teacher, either in the classroom or virtually, to figure out how to convey that information. So some teachers might do it with a video project, and another teacher might do it with a book report, or, you know, there's always going to be different things. I think with distance learning, what has happened is all the teachers have had this huge learning curve of trying to get everything online. And I can tell you, you know, I've taught an online course before, but it wasn't an ongoing live course. It was modules. So someone played it, you know, when they had convenient time. It took so much preparation to do my 6-week class that was played at someone's leisure. I mean, it took months of preparation. I cannot imagine how much work this is taking for our teachers and staff. And I feel that they are really caught in the crosshairs. They want so badly to be with kids. They do this because they love educating, and they don't have that feedback, and they don't get to know their kids. I actually spoke with one of my daughter's teachers the other day. She has 410 students. If she were in the building, she would get to know them. But right now, she just looks at a computer screen all day. You know, she can't see their faces. She doesn't know when they're engaged. She doesn't know how to reach out to them and help them. And I think that is an additional challenge for the teachers, is figuring out how to make that connection with students.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually spoke at the intro a little bit about this. Even for us as adults, it's really a big difference in reading the energies if you're not in the same room with a person. So for our audience as well, I mean, this is not in the same ballpark even. So for kids, I can imagine that this is even a lot more difficult to really read and understand where they're at a time. That's very, very difficult. I wanted to talk a little bit more about how people are affected who cannot rely on speech. And I'm actually very sorry to say we did have a third guest scheduled for tonight. And she is the founder and co-chair of the Arlington Inclusion Task Force. But unfortunately, she got sick, and so she cannot join us tonight. But that organization actually advocates and represents people specifically who cannot rely on speech. So now I'm going to go right forward to the fourth guest, which is Brooke Varma. She's director of Inclusive Ministry Church, and she's also an inclusion consultant. Good evening, Brooke. Can you hear us?
I can. Good to be here.
That's great. So now we have you all introduced, and we can actually go right in. Can we go back for a second and talk a little bit about the speech aspect? So how are kids, and apparently I know Tona, who can't be with us tonight, she says her organization represents 5 million kids who are affected by that. How does that how are kids affected with speech in an online environment?
I actually have my third grader has a speech and language diagnosis of apraxia, and for her it's been a little bit of a struggle because she also has a fine motor delay. So specifically in working with her, we're dealing with an issue where she's not always intelligible to her class when she raises her hand to speak. And she's not able to access the chat to use that as an appropriate means of communicating with her class. So again, and I know I speak from a place of privilege, but I'm home with her and able to act as her one-on-one when she is in these classes. And I usually have to speak for her. So she'll speak and then I speak over her to clarify what she's saying. And that has been a really big struggle, is trying to figure out how to help her intelligibility virtually. It's much easier in person for her.
That means basically that a parent has to be home all the time, no?
In our case, it does. We're very fortunate to both be able to be home and to have support and to have jobs that allow that. So again, it's a place of privilege to speak from with that. But really watching that struggle and that lack of understanding of her verbal communication mixed with her inability to use the chat is it's a big personal struggle for her. But she is very tenacious, so has no interest in not trying to talk to her classmates.
So how does this affect the overall mood and willingness to participate in class and in school?
I think it really depends on the student. At our church, we have Green Tree Christian School, and that school has been in person since the beginning. And that's a struggle that we hear from a lot of our parents, was just that need to, the motivation of the interaction, as the other panelists mentioned, that, the fun part of school, that motivating factor of school for a lot of kids really does cause some shutting down. Again, jumping back to my personal hat of being, an online virtual working mom, my daughter does not lack that motivation to speak, and so she, Diane's laughing because Diane, she finds a way to communicate one way or another, and her new catchphrase at the end of every statement is, "Do you hear me or no?" So she'll, say what, answer the question and say, "Do you hear me or no?" And she's very tenacious. Now I have friends who are AAC users, so they use a device like Proloquo to Go or LAMP to communicate, and that is just a whole additional level of complications in having these individuals have the opportunity to speak and to be engaging with their classrooms.
Now, we talked a lot about how the kids are affected, but let's get for a second to how parents are affected. Since what is your personal, how do I say this? How do you feel about this when you see your daughter struggle with that? What is your personal reaction to that? Like, what are the personal boundaries or challenges that you feel you run or bump into every day?
With her, I really find that my biggest challenge is I'm actually given this front row seat now to her education. So when I see her not being challenged, that can be very frustrating. But then again, on the plus side, having this front row seat and knowing what curriculum is being presented to her, I can send an email and say, hey, I noticed that today we were doing 1-digit addition. She can actually do 2-digit addition with regrouping. What do we need to do here? Because this is not where we're at. So it's a both and for me personally. It is definitely hard to play the teacher role at times. But seeing her, I will say she is thriving academically, and she's very engaged during her core academics. Now, anything that's not core academics, she could care less about, and it's much harder to engage her. But I just have a very differently motivated kid. If something is hard for her, she wants to figure it out and figure out why. And so we're excelling at that. But as a parent, it's taxing, and it can be frustrating. And again, I'm privileged. I'm able to work and to be home. My husband's also able to do similarly. So it is not easy. I'm very, very blessed to have the job that I have and be able to support, an inclusive education for our kiddos in person at work while being able to support my daughter virtually at home.
Yeah, because you're right in the middle of it. And I do want to talk a little bit more about the exact initiatives and your approach as we go forward. I want to get back to Diane here for a second. Diane, what are your personal challenges with that? Like, where do you feel I'm running against the wall, every day because there's just something that that you're struggling with?
Yeah, I would say I can speak for myself, and I can also speak for, we have a Facebook group that has well over 1,000 members. And so we hear literally all day, every day from parents writing in. I also have a support group that I run. And I know a lot of parents are feeling totally overwhelmed and really worried about their kids. So I can speak to that, as my daughter and I actually, on the other side of this room is my daughter's desk, and we are sharing an office during the day. So I'm working from my desk, she's working from hers. And I will tell you, we had an entire week of tears one week because the frustration of this format was just getting so overwhelming. And as a parent, it's hard to know, do I intervene? Do I let her handle this? So my daughter's older, she's 13. So how much do I impose myself on this? How much do I let her battle through it? And I'll tell you personally, I have decided in my head that the goal for this year is to have my kids still enjoy learning and to not regress. And I think every family has a different bar kind of that they have to set for themselves. We're in a global pandemic. We have immune issues in our house, so we can't go back even when school gets back in session until there is a better handle on COVID. So we just have to say we're in unprecedented territory, as much as that term is starting to drive me crazy because you hear it all the time now. It's true, and nobody knows how this is going to affect us long term. And we're just going to have to be flexible and continue to find the joy. But I hear, I think we're all, Lucy and Brooke and I are all actually speaking from a point of privilege in which we can actually be there for our kids, or there's a family member that can be. But one of the things that I am hearing the most desperation and sadness and complex feelings from parents is, I have to work. I don't know what to do. And I don't know how to help my kid. And my kid's just given up, not engaging, running away, and they feel they're failing their children. And that is something on a mental health side that I think is an element of this environment that is really tough. I think that the parents feel that they're going to fail their children if they don't figure out a way to get their children learning. And children who have various kinds of disabilities and they've had to fight so hard to progress, the fear that your kid will regress and just fall apart or lose skills that were so hard to attain is it's really real and it's really visceral. And I don't know that there is a good solution for anyone, but it's a real place of anxiety for a lot of parents.
So that there's obviously a lot of emotional and mental stress on that. But what is out there? Are these parents, is there something out there right now where parents can actually find support? Or is there something like visible that's coming up where parents can find support? Or are they all left hanging dry basically right now where we're at?
Honestly, there's a lot of people left hanging dry, and that's the hard part. But I don't know if Lucy has some ideas about more community resources. I know, for friends of mine and, who may actually be on a disability waiver, it can be very difficult to find someone to actually come into your house to support your child right now. First of all, because it's always hard because the pay is very low and that is state regulated. But the other piece of it is that is it safe to have someone coming into your home?
Yeah.
Are they safe? Do they feel safe coming into your home? And do you feel safe having them come into your home? And so there's a lot of questions about, even if theoretically some support were possible, is it practically available? So I would imagine Lucy might have some more thoughts on that.
Yeah, Lucy, do you have some input for us on this one? Is there something going on within the community where parents can find help?
To Diane's point, it's almost privileged to even be able to ask for help, right? Because to ask for help means you have access to a device. You have means to accept that help. You are either able to have your child in a space where other people are existing because you don't have people who are severely immune compromised in your house. You have the ability to rearrange your schedule and be with folks. It's really challenging. So certainly we welcome any family to reach out to the ARC of Northern Virginia for free. We are happy to help families know, here are your educational rights. Here are things you can ask for in terms of accommodations from the schools, and maybe those kinds of things would make it easier. And rely on your neighborhood listserv and your local SEPTA Facebook page and your general school Facebook page and your countywide Facebook page, right? Ask for help. Ask, and if nothing else, I've got to say, a daily reminder that you are not alone is such a big deal. And a daily reminder that other parents feel as sad and scared and overwhelmed and frustrated as you are is a big deal. And obviously that's no solution, but I can say as a parent, the days that have been the hardest for us in our house are when I felt like I was doing so much worse than everybody else. And to just reach out and say, is anyone else having this problem? It's worth the 5,000 chats I get on WhatsApp every day from one of my kids' school classroom groups. And every time one of us says, like, I can't even log in to find the science work, someone will answer. And my kids are in an immersion school, and someone will answer in English, and someone else will answer in Spanish, and someone will take screenshots, right? It's just all of us are taking whatever little bit of mommy, daddy energy we have left or thrown up in the
Yeah. So there are things out there, and we do want to talk more about that. We're almost ready to go in the break. We're almost at halfway at the show point. When we come back, I do want to speak more about what's out there for help, what you can use, and where you can go. Stay with us. Welcome back to Smart Sustainability. I'm Nicolette DeVidar. Tonight we talk about inclusive education and how it is affected by online learning. As we've heard in the first half of the show, a lot of people, particularly parents, are completely overwhelmed and students are increasingly frustrated. So in the second half of the program, we like to talk a little bit more about what's actually out there as a resource, where can you go to find some help, what can we come up with, and maybe there's a lot of room to actually find or come up with new ideas in how we can move forward with inclusive education at times of online learning. So thank you so much to all of my guests who are back here. Parents can come to the ARC. Is it accessible for anyone? Let's start with this.
I would hope so. It's a strange situation because I can say you can virtually come to us, right? At this point, our office closed for our staff and everyone else in early March. And we're certainly going to be physically closed through the end of December, though we are working full steam from home. So now I'm at a point where if someone leaves a message at our office, I have to be able to return it from my personal cell phone. And because it's my personal cell phone, it's a blocked number. So if I get a message saying, this call doesn't accept blocked numbers, We're in a tough situation. So what I, by and large, encourage families to do, and I've always encouraged them to do, is go to the arcofnova.org/answers, or just the arcofnova.org, and click information and referral right at the top of the page. And you can put in a short question because you cannot get your thoughts together, or you can put in a long rambling question because you have so many thoughts to share. And no matter what it is, I personally answer every inquiry that goes into that portal. You'll get an automatic reply saying, here's some quick links to common questions, but I will come and contact you. And if I get plenty of parents who just say, like, I'm overwhelmed. And as much as I would love it, I don't have any magic answers out there, but I can certainly say, here are rights, here are options, here are creative solutions we have found from other families. You are doing a great job, because if you are working this hard and you're reaching out to me, I promise you, you're rocking it, and we're gonna be okay. And you can keep coming back, and you can keep asking questions, and you can keep asking for other families' creative ideas indefinitely. I've been there more than a decade, well over a decade, and I never told someone they asked too many questions. And I feel like that open door policy is the best we can give to families in this really challenging situation.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about what's going on in terms of inclusion efforts right now going forward. So we talked a little bit about what helps parents, but let's talk now in this next segment here, what's actually being done. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the initiatives that are going on, like, for example, SEPTA. Diane, that would be you. What exactly are you guys doing to advance the inclusive education at this time?
Yeah, so we actually, SEPTA's been very active since the COVID first hit in March. We have had 2 town halls over the summer distance learning, where we collected questions from the community. So I think it was less than a week, we collected over 350 questions from the community that we then collated, narrowed down into categories, and sent to Fairfax County's superintendent, school board, and Department of Special Services that houses special education. And we are continuing to reach out. We are actually, Fairfax actually has a new assistant superintendent of the Department of Special Services. She's just started literally in September, Dr. Michelle Boyd, and she is going to have a meet and greet town hall with us on October, I want to say it's the 20th, gotta look at my calendar.
Yep.
It's the 20th. Yes, it's the 20th.
October?
Of October, and that is actually it's a free event. So we're doing a lot of free online events. So they're open to anyone in the community. If you want to find us, we're very active on Facebook. So we have a Facebook page, but it's actually our Facebook group that has most of the conversation and support happening. And then there's various offshoot groups that you can get involved with. And you don't
have to be a member, correct? So anyone can go and access?
Right. So we really strongly encourage people to become members, because the only way we operate is 100% through membership and donations. So otherwise we can't function. But we also feel that the mission really strongly is to help parents. And there are plenty of parents in our community who just simply cannot afford to join. It's not an expensive membership, but every dollar counts. So we don't want to exclude anyone. Our members sometimes get a little perk, like get to register first and things like that if there's limited occupancy. But so no, you do not have to be a member, and you do not have to be a member of SEPTA to join our Facebook group. We just want to ensure that you're a real person, not a bot, and that you will be able to, participate in the community. So.
Parents can find out about this, student can find out about that. Brooke, are you doing, since you're an inclusion consultant, what are some of the activities or the initiatives you're doing right now to advance inclusive education?
The main thing I'm really seeing, particularly now that we have switched to virtual, is going back to the idea of what is meaningful inclusion. I think the term inclusion, it gets tossed around a lot, but at the end of the day, is it actually meaningful to that particular student? I think those of us who are familiar with IEPs know at the end you get a box and a grid and a percentage of time. But what does it really mean, and what does it mean to that child? So many students are included in recess, for example, which is a time that my daughter's included. And it's wonderful, but she likes to run and be on her own. And so is she really being included? So we go back to what is meaningful to that student. It's meaningful for her to be in gen ed for math because it is a hard subject for her, but one that she is personally very, very invested in learning. So for her to be included and then to have that education tailored to meet her needs, to find what her aligned standards are based on that general education exposure, that really is the best case scenario for her. So it gets back to what is meaningful. Is it a meaningful, it's not all three, I'm saying three because I can only see two people, but all of us here have very different jobs, even though some of us do very similar things or have a similar passion. But what I do may not be meaningful to somebody else. It's not specific to the disability community to really find a meaningfully inclusive education or employment. And that's really what we try to do across the board. And when we're looking at in-person, even during, COVID, as I said, over at Christ Church, Green Tree Christian School is open. So what we've had to do is just, look at what are the safety protocols? What do we need to do because of COVID while opening our doors for children who just cannot learn in a virtual way or who just choose to come to our school. So it's really finding the meaningful piece of inclusion, not inclusion for the sake of a percentage, not inclusion for the sake of we checked this box and my child is eating lunch with a friend, even though, yes, that is so meaningful and so important for some of our students, absolutely. But what is truly meaningful and individualized. And I really feel like that was the struggle before COVID. I feel like that's the struggle now, is we call it an individualized education plan, but we're not dumb. There's boxes. You cannot operate a school system without boxes. So no matter how individualized a plan can be, you're still basically saying, which box does this child best fit into? And that's really hard for a lot of students.
I'm actually going to challenge this here for a second when you say which box does this child fit into. So when you look at the 21st century and we look at the requirements that we have, we know that customization is really the name of the game because we need so many customized solutions. And when you look at the online learning, you talked about meaningful. Even in online learning, there's a lot of teachers and people who come up with curriculums. They are only learning now that even for an online learning, having a meaningful online course is a dimension on its own. So why can we not have a customized approach to kids? Some schools are already doing that.
I absolutely think we can. I think the problem, my assumption is that what would be said to that is it's a budgeting issue, which I, as in my consultant hat, would say, well, that's not the problem of the child. That there's not a budgeting, there's not budgeting for this particular support that's needed, because it's not just meaningful inclusion; it's the meaningful environment and the meaningful supports that are going to help that student be successful. What we find at, and we're a private school, so we have, different ways of operating. We can keep class sizes small as we present with an environment that's more inclusive by nature. And by partnering with the parents and with other related services, we can have them bring in the supports that are meaningful to that particular child to help them be successful in our inclusive environment. It's definitely possible. It's been done. We see it being done, but at the end of the day, my assumption is it's a financial issue when it comes to things like a child who could be very meaningfully included in general education, but would require, for example, a one-on-one to support their behavior and their success in that classroom. Because what we often hear is that's a full-time job. That's somebody being paid a full-time salary to support one student. So that is why that box system has existed and continues to exist. Yeah.
Can I jump in on this one too?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. I think what Brooke is saying is really right on the money, as it were. I think with any large system, so Fairfax is a massive school system. We have almost 200,000 students, a little bit less right now because a lot are dropping out because of COVID. But even that is its own problem, right? Because the students leave the school, disenroll. the school system gets less funding, even though ironically the costs go up because we're providing meals and we're providing technology to every single child in the system. So the way that education funding works is it's really tricky. And any system you have at all, the biggest challenge is scalability. So something that works on a really small scale is very hard to scale up, and the expense and the training grows exponentially. So it's not an excuse, but it is a real actual problem that has to be solved. And it's extremely difficult. And, when we talk about inclusive education, a lot of this there's no one quick fix. It's a lot of different pieces. It has to do with funding. It has to do with education pipeline, because we have fewer and fewer people going into the teaching profession. So there's actually I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but there's a lack of, or a dearth of teachers coming into the system, especially special education teachers, because it is an extremely demanding job. We don't pay them enough to live comfortably in where they have to work. So there's a lot of issues that come up, as well as the fact that individual therapies are expensive and our staffing ratios are kind of bananas. So a student who might, and I have one of these students, or children, who might do fantastic with inclusion in a small class of 10 students, that simply doesn't exist in Fairfax County at this point. So in order to get a special education support and a small class size, then he loses out on access to certain academics. So you're constantly in this balance. And so to jump off of that to what can you do, constantly advocate, but also there are things that are happening, and we would suggest that you as a family work out as much as possible realistically to help your kid in the virtual environment. So if you have a student with ADHD or a student that has attention issues for any reason, the schools will actually provide, if they have an IEP, certain equipment. And for some students, even with a 504 plan, for example, they will provide actual things to bring into the home to help the student. So there are pedals that you can pedal under your desk to keep your body active. There's bouncy balls and wiggle chairs and things like that. So there are things that can be brought into the home environment, and the school can support families in that. But as Lucy mentioned earlier, sometimes just knowing to ask for help is a privilege. And so I think one thing to get out to parents is that if your child needs extra support, as the family member, you can reach out to the school. And if you're not getting the support you need, keep going up the chain. Don't feel bad about it, and know that they're there to help you and to serve your student.
Oh, yeah, just to clarify for our audience, so did you hear that? If you do have issues with that, please reach out, because there are many people in the same boat, and it's really important that you speak up and make your voice heard, and also share your concern and your pains. I wanted to, it's really a shame, I had a fifth guest tonight where I pre-taped an interview with yesterday. Her name is Faiza Alam. She is a special ed teacher with a rather unique hands-on methodology in using nature as an example to learn from nature in an inclusive education effort. It's more of a blended teaching environment she uses for kids to go outside in their gardens or yards or whatsoever, and then come back in and go online and have everyone participate, and have the child itself really talk about their own discovery, which by definition allows a lot of the customized learning, because you really let the child go through the experiences and share where they're at. And this has been phenomenally successful.
So thank you for having me on your show. It's always a pleasure, Nicolette, to be with you. And learning, learning is a unique, and, in this pandemic has really given us as teachers, as educators and parents and students, totally a new normal that none of us were prepared for, right? None of us knew how to navigate this. There is no handbook to learn how to work in a pandemic, right? And we're all trying to make the best in this situation. And with distance learning in the March when the school closed, and we all walked one day and didn't even realize that tomorrow we won't be going back, right? And learning did not stop. This generation is a very, very unique generation that later down their lives, they have been blessed with a situation. There is a silver lining in everything I see, that the positive, that they have learned how to navigate through this difficult time. Students have done it beautifully. And as teachers, we have totally been flexible in modifying and making sure, and being a special education exceptional needs teacher, my focus is always, as I have mentioned to you before, to take the learning outside the four walls, right? So it should not be just on the computer. It should not be within the four walls. It needs to be the real world connection. And that is the key that kids will remember. And so we are giving them a real world situation right now, right? This pandemic has happened and they're learning to how to navigate this, be a problem solver. And in addition to that, I mean, as a science teacher, since March, as distance learning started, we made sure that kids were not just having screen time and having students do investigation and experimental design outside, whether it call it kitchen science or nature science. We did that. That's what I did. So students had to go outside to learn the environmental change in the
So what does that look like though in the curriculum? So they do their online courses and then there is an outside component to it where they go outside and do their stuff and study and research, and then they come back in and share their results online. How does this work?
So it's a great question. So I will just give an example of an ecosystem, whether I'm teaching a food chain or a food web. I go outdoor in my outdoor classroom in my school and I teach from there, where I show them, I walk around, I do a nature walk myself. I record myself doing the nature walk or seeing the change in the environment. Let's say what are the responses of the plant and the animals when you walk out and see. So I do the same thing. And then the kids come back and they will talk about, and then we will talk about tropism and how different ways the plants respond to the seasons or the change or gravity or light. So going outside instead of just giving them a PowerPoint presentation. And this also brings a very important point of inclusion, as you're saying. There is no one way to understand tropism and how plants are affected by different things, right? So it levels the playing field for all students. Every kid is going to explore this in their own way and reach their new heights. Right? So
okay, hang on a second. So when you say it levels the playing field, from your experience, what you mean by it levels the playing field is because everyone goes outside, everyone makes their own discovery, the way their nature, their natural way of thinking works, and then they share their discovery, and with that, they share their very unique way of insight with everyone else.
Okay. And also they share it, and they sometimes don't know what the talent is hidden inside them, right? So when we tell them to go and explore, go outside, like even now when I give them a break, I'm teaching them food chain or food web. Okay, this is your break, 10 minutes, go outside. So we cannot hold our kids in this tight one size fits all curriculum, right? The curriculum, the standard is there. It's just like benchmarks, right? We can build it how we want it. We need to give that to the students so they can just take it and use it the way they will remember it and they can absorb it, right? And blended learning approach absolutely will be very, very helpful going forward. And I think that might become the new normal.
Some good approaches. So my question is, are we maybe at a time where we need to rethink how we educate?
I would jump in and say, I hope so. I call for a lot of people to really, again, focus on the meaningful piece of inclusion, even virtually. Virtual education has provided us an opportunity both as parents, I'm sure for educators and for the school teams. I feel much more a part of my daughter's team because I have that firsthand knowledge. And it's really given me the opportunity to help others meet her where she is and to see those opportunities for inclusion that I'm not going to forget when we're back in person. I won't forget how essential those were during virtual learning. And as I think Lucy alluded to, putting those puzzle pieces back together when we go back, taking some of these learned experiences from COVID and carrying them back with us. I think this is a real opportunity to shake things up, to bring students back into a school that is going to to be more individualized to their needs. And again, I feel so divided as I speak because I am at the school that my daughter is at. We have been meaningfully and wonderfully included at every single step. As a consultant, I am called when that is not the case. So I also feel like I need to represent the families that come to me when, I have multiple families, as Diane said, who have left the county public school because they couldn't get what they needed for their child in special education. And then, I've got an inclusive school that's being run by, incredible staff that's in person and, doing great things in person. So it is possible. It's just, as Diane said, there's this framework where money is a barrier, and we're getting that funding and those pipelines, all the loopholes stand in the way, and that's really my greatest concern. I really hope we can take this time to meaningfully think about what going back to school looks like, which again, can't imagine in a pandemic when we're all focused on how to make virtual work. But somebody's got to, there's got to be a table somewhere of people. There's got to be a group of people talking about what we're going to do when we get back to school and how we're going to make it meaningfully inclusive to every single one of our students.
So let's brainstorm here for a second. Let's say there are no barriers. If we leave the barriers outside, and very often the barriers are kind of in preconceived notions that we all have. So what if we leave the barriers outside for a moment and we think about how inclusive education of the future ideally could look like? What would be key components of that? Not thinking in terms of issues and obstacles and barriers, but if really from a standpoint of purely going at what really does it take? What would it need? What would it look like?
I think customized to the student. And one of the interesting things that we have learned with virtual education is we have the technology to totally customize things to each student. So maybe a kiddo who could be really successfully included, except for the fact that their vocalizations or their behaviors make it hard for other students to learn, can sit in an adjacent classroom when they're having a tough time and watch and listen to the same classroom as their peers on mute, right? Maybe we find out that kids who are really struggling in some settings can do well and communicate on communication devices because they actually ended up being really savvy on Zoom. And this is the key to getting them having conversations with peers and talking. I just feel like we are only bounded, to your point, by these preconceived limits. And if nothing else, this is the time to challenge all of that.
That's right.
And to say, what is the best thing that we have learned from virtual learning? If it was one thing that worked for my kid, how do we integrate that back into their IEP? And is it the fact that now my child has a choice on asynchronous Mondays of which activity to do first? And we found a whole different level of motivation when there's some flexibility in their day and they can save the favorite part for last, or they can have a break when they need it. What kind of changes did we see in them? And to start putting those in place, because if we can do it virtually, goodness knows when we're in person and we have so many more resources at our disposal. Yeah. All those things should be options and more.
I'd love to jump in here too. I think, as much as, virtual learning has provided a lot of difficulty for some students and families, there are some of us, like my family, who also have a student who has benefited from it extremely. So it's actually up to his inclusion. So there are lots of students in the county who, for various reasons, might be on homebound education, which we were on homebound last year, which means that the student is at home all the time. And what's interesting is Fairfax actually in some classrooms had a robot, which I can't remember the name of it. Do you remember this, Brooke?
Yes.
That the kid would go to the different classrooms and participate. But that's kind of an initiative that's stalled. It's not really going anywhere. But this is a way, if we can start thinking about how to use the technology to our advantage, that a student who had to have chemotherapy, for example, and was going to be out of the building for a long time, how they could continue to participate and be included in their classroom environment, or how a student on homebound with severe anxiety or for some other reason is not able to get in the door to school could still be a part of the classroom, could still engage with their peers. And I think that when you have major boundaries that prevent you from going into the building, there's lots of periods of education that just get dropped. When you have a serious medical issue, you might be in surgery and out of the classroom, and then you're just getting assignments sent home a little bit willy-nilly. You're not really engaging with the students. The homebound teacher can only come 1 or 2 days a week for a couple hours. Mm-hmm. It's a totally different picture. And so I think if we could, like Lucy said, take the best parts of this and figure out how to utilize them even when we go back in person, and recognize that we have different kinds of learners. So one size isn't going to fit all. We can have a variety of choices.
And I would just add to that is paying our teachers, particularly our special education teachers, our IAs, people who are expected to come in and just do a almost impossible job sometimes. Pay our teachers, pay them what they should be getting paid for educating our students. I also think smaller class sizes across the board would be hugely helpful. Just that increase in pay for our teachers, making those classes a little bit smaller, you would open up inclusion for so many students with just those two things.
Yeah, I cannot support that enough. I think Brooke is 100% right. I think literally just having, it sounds so simplistic, but I really believe it's true, especially after speaking with hundreds of families. Just smaller class sizes would eliminate so many barriers for so many kids. Not all kids, but for a lot of kids, it would be hugely helpful. And to the teacher piece of this, I also think we need to change how we train our teachers. I'm dyslexic. My daughter is dyslexic. One thing that we are not training our teachers in is the science of reading. And so, for example, if we, address, if we don't just ask our special education teachers to learn about difference, but we ask all of our teachers to learn about difference. And we also employ teachers with differences. So you might have a teacher who is in a wheelchair, or you might have a teacher with an AAC device. Imagine what kind of modeling that is, that you could see yourself reflected in the adults that are teaching you. And so I think thinking about inclusion, not just for our students, but also for our staff and also in their training.
So lived inclusion, that's definitely a big point. And we definitely have the technology. And I think one of the really big pluses of digitization in general is that it takes down boundaries. The key is always to how do we bring it together and unite it and make it so that it works, so that it's blended. Now, in terms of, we talked a little bit about technology, which, by the way, Lucy, I don't even think that would be so costly because the technology is there, right? So we could possibly, once we drop all those preconceived notions of thinking that things are not possible, we could actually get to some pretty decent and feasible solutions, probably even more cost effective than what we're doing now. So we could free up some money to pay teachers more, to have higher salaries, and also value that more. But that's actually another issue, because if you think about, we live in a society where CEOs get paid so much money, and the jobs that we have in society that actually really benefit other people most, you have nurses and teachers and things like that, they usually get the short end of the stick, but that's another show topic. However, talking about mindset shifts, we have about 2 minutes left, and I want to talk very quickly about some of the things, those preconceptions that we can drop. Can any of you say some other things that we really need to change our thinking?
I feel like this has turned everything on its head, right? We used to say, no, we can't pre-record. No, a student can't participate in music class from home. No, a student who is going to be really disruptive in the classroom can't take part in the classroom setting. No, parents can't closely observe what we're doing on a daily basis and be a part of it, right? Like, well, It looks like we can. And it looks like some cool things can come from that, right? We can turn this all around. And like we've said, take the best parts of an awful situation, and for the love, just to have it made that we went through all of this and some benefit came from it. And I know Brooke and Diane must have great ideas too.
I would just say, the lowered bar of expecting a student to be competent needs to be replaced with expecting brilliance and taking the time to find the individual brilliance in each student. And I think that would change education and beyond.
Yeah, I would agree with Brooke. One thing I'm seeing with a lot of adapted education students is that the bar has been dropped. There's sort of this always the teaching to the lowest common denominator rather than assuming that every child can learn. And I think that we need to really take this opportunity to do that. And for students who are struggling, not to make the assumption that this is because they can't or they won't. Because a lot of times for our kids, especially neurodiverse kids, we hear that.
So that really goes to the heart of looking at the potential that everyone has versus thinking that, oh, there are limitations and we can't do that. So, and if COVID has shown us anything, it says that the unthinkable has become thinkable. So why don't we start with education and inclusive education to begin with to see what we can change. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.